Hello and welcome to UCL Global Health. Since 2007, the world has become more urban than rural in that more than half the world's population live in cities. And we're seeing the emergence of huge urban areas across the emerging economies. And that presents a whole set of new problems. And I'm joined by Barbara Lipietz from our development planning unit. She's a lecturer here at UCL. You've worked in Johannesburg. You're doing a study linking Johannesburg and London. You've also worked in Latin America and Thailand. There are some huge challenges here about how you plan cities. The images of crime and chaos and traffic jams and everything. How do you bring a kind of participatory approach to sensible urban planning?
It's an enormous question, Anthony. Thank you for starting with that one. I think there's several components to that question. One of which, if we're speaking more or less from an African perspective, is recognizing, first of all, that we need to take the governance of cities seriously.
Right.
And that in itself is a challenge. And then there's a challenge on top of that of bringing to that planning and management of city in a participatory fashion.
Are you saying that the governance of cities is not taken seriously because there's some suspicion about urbanization?
Yes.
In countries that are still predominantly politically rural in their mentality?
Yes, I think that's the notion that actually cities are the engine of economic growth, are sort of places that are going to pull national economies is something that is worldwide recognized, that is in all these sort of international studies, in the World Bank, UN, etc. But whether it's actually politically accepted by many African leaders is another question. So there's a sort of oral acceptation of that. There's a lot of grand statements made about that. We need to look after our cities. But the actual practice of it, in terms of where is the money going, where are there the sort of institutional infrastructures that facilitate taking cities seriously in many African countries, is still very much in question.
So back to my first question. In rural areas of Africa, you've got many very well-developed traditional systems, not just Africa actually, all over traditional societies where you've got elders and councils and participation. Does that all break up when people move into cities? Or are you trying to recapture that? And if so, how can you do it?
I think it's an interesting question, and it's one that will have very different responses in different parts of Africa, which is such a complex and varied...
We'll talk about Joburg.
Okay. So in Joburg, interestingly, there isn't really a recognition in current attempts to reconfigure the post-apartheid city. There isn't really a recognition or taking into account of these traditional sort of processes of rule and institutions. That is much more the case, though, in Durban, because Durban is in the heart of Zululand, where there was and where there's been a real attempt to include into the post-apartheid urban reconstruction, if you want, the role of chieftaincies and traditional institutions. In Johannesburg, partly because these institutions were always less strong, partly because it's a place of immense migration. You have people coming in from various parts of South Africa in a way that Durban is much more sort of Zulu.
Traditional,
the traditional chieftaincies are more coherent, have been there for much longer. In Johannesburg, there's been that continuous mix, which means that...
So you're doing a comparison with London. This is really interesting because I'm from South London, and I think South London's more like Durban, and North London's a bit more like Johannesburg, because North London is traditionally all the migrants coming in, and although you've had migration in South London, the traditional structures are a little bit...
That's a very interesting comparison. So in London, where there's currently also an attempt, since the GLA has been reconfigured, to develop...
That's the Greater London Authority.
The Greater London Authority, yes. To reconstitute a sense of metropolitan vision and a vision for the city, a forward-looking vision for the city. So it is also quite nascent in a way. I mean, it's only since the early 2000s that this has happened. And there is an attempt there at the level of the boroughs and of the GLA to construct this vision. And also it's done in, following this sort of international best practice approach in a participatory fashion. It's done in a quite different way because it's done through what is called examination in public. So the public is invited to provide its own information about evidence about London, upon which policies and strategies can be made.
So it's a sort of top-down managed process where people are invited in.
But what is interesting is that it's not a consultation, because the notion of evidence in public provides in principle more leeway for community groups to actually challenge the way in which policies are made, because they have the possibility to say, actually, we have this kind of evidence about the way in which housing is developing, lack of housing, about ways in which sort of, anything about education, health, the environment. And they're able, if they do it in a proper manner, if they do it in a sophisticated manner, they're able to table that at those meetings. And then there is an independent inspector which listens to these various kinds of information, these various knowledges of the city, if you want, and is therefore able to question the ways in which the plan that has been proposed by the officials and bureaucrats of the GLA can be reconfigured.
So this is London.
This is London.
Is this model going to be transplanted to Johannesburg, or have they got a completely different model?
So just to finish on the London case, to return to your sort of south versus north, what has been really interesting there is that it has encourage the formation of cross-London, pan-London community groups to start speaking to each other about these kinds of questions. And it's a very difficult process to do anywhere in the world. And there are here some organizations that have started doing that process, and it's been incredibly generative for them. In fact, UCL is working with one of these organizations called Just Space, and they have responded increasingly well to these examinations in public by providing evidence from all different parts of London.
Right.
And it's been quite a challenge for them, not only to think through different sectors, but also to think through different parts of the city and how they talk to each other and how the experiences are very, very different across the city.
So where next then for Africa? And you've mentioned Joburg, which you love, and it's a great city. It has a terrible press, but actually it's a really exciting place.
Exactly.
And do you see a sort of whole transformation over the next decade in the way cities are managed, not just in Johannesburg and South Africa, which is a middle-income country, but perhaps in other places like Nigeria, Kenya?
Well, the interesting thing about this, so there's this challenge of actually city governments accepting that, or rather national government accepting that maybe they need to support cities in their ability to engage with these enormous planning and management issues that you mentioned before. That is one hurdle to happen. In the countries where it's happening, the next hurdle, as we mentioned, was this notion of doing it in a participatory process. Now, there's a lot of learning experimentation that is going on. There's still places where this is still not at all accepted. So, for instance, the latest Kigali 2020 plan for the city, which won, by the way, an award from the American Planners Association, is completely top-down. It's a traditional master plan, not at all participatory. But there are experiments. Some of them engage processes of participatory budgeting. Some of them are embracing what is called city development strategy. So this notion that you try and develop a forward-looking plan for the city in a collaborative fashion, involving a whole variety of stakeholders. Johannesburg was one of the trailblazers in that policy innovation, if you want, which has a lot of parallelism with strategic planning in the north, in cities of the north. There's issues with it. In fact, its first attempt to do that in a participatory way collapsed, actually. So it tried to do that in the 2000s. And it was clear that it was very, very conflictual, because you get people around the table with very different perceptions about what needs to be done, what are the priorities, what are the trade-offs. And it actually collapsed. That first iteration of doing that
But it
collapsed.
has worked, hasn't it, in Latin America, in Asia?
Yes, it has. I mean, It has worked in certain places. There's a lot of places where these experiments in participation have worked. There's a lot of places where they have worked to a certain extent, and there's a lot of room for maneuver. Right. The participatory budget example, the most famous and the most sort of long-standing and the most progressive and challenging and participatory, but truly participatory, is the one in Porto Alegre. And it's still ongoing.
In Brazil?
In Brazil. Porto Alegre in Brazil. And it's still ongoing, and it has had some real difference and impact in terms of reconfiguring the budget and the way in which it actually is going to poorer sections of the city, and ways in which various parts of the city can start being thought about as a whole. You also have, as opposed to, let's focus on the rich parts of the city and the poorer parts of the city. Right. You have other experiments also of participatory budgeting where they've tried to include the voices of women more, for instance, or the voices of the youth more. So there's some very interesting experiment. But even to go back to the case of Johannesburg, which collapsed in its first iteration, they are now trying to revise and review and re-energize this notion of participatory engagement. And they've just come through a very intense process of participation and engagement with a whole variety of people in the city, community groups, business groups, experts, etc. It's still not perfect. It's still something that they need to work on, that they're constantly reflecting about. And next week there's going to be a Metropolis conference, which is the conference of cities, of metropolitan cities, which have their.
Where's that?
They have an annual meeting, and the one in 2013 in July will be in Johannesburg. And there's going to be a whole debate and conversation around how do we think about engaged citizens at the citywide scale. So we're going to look at this London example, the Joburg example, participatory budgeting, these examples of more sort of bottom-up call for participatory planning processes that are taking place, for instance, in Thailand, the ones that I mentioned to you earlier on. Examples also actually in Tanzania of federation of the federation of I forgot their name, but the Federation of Poor People who are coming together around slum upgrading and realizing that actually if they want to reconfigure the city towards more socially and spatially just futures, that just focusing on a project level, slum upgrading in your neighborhood is vitally important, but it's not enough. Yeah. That you really need to start now thinking at a metropolitan scale. So there's pressures from above, pressures from below for that, realizing that it's really important, but there's also a lot of constraints and it's complicated. But it's exciting.
But it's a very exciting space, and it's where North and South can learn from each other.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
Barbara, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.